Hi. So we're here to talk about the pay gap. I was going to ask if you guys knew what it was in the U.S., but I feel like this audience probably knows that in the U.S. the pay gap still exists. It's 20%, but it's also not really getting any better. I think, yeah, we have a Bloomberg chart up there. It shows that wage growth for men is faster than it is for women. There's been so much effort to try to improve the pay gap, and yet it hasn't been fixed. If you're wondering, why does the pay gap still exist? There's a new Bloomberg podcast coming out tomorrow, hosted by me, called The Paycheck. You should download it. It has great stories by me and tons of other Bloomberg journalists. It's going to be really good. But you're here to learn about how to close the pay gap, and we have three people here who are working pretty hard on doing that. I'm just going to reintroduce them really quickly so we know them in order. This is Anil Dash. He's the CEO of Fog Creek. He's also a prolific tweeter, so if you want to follow him on Twitter, it's very entertaining and informative. And he's in the middle of a big experiment at his company to try to close the pay gap. Natasha Lam is sitting closest on the other side. She's at Arjuna Capital and has forced huge companies like Apple and Citibank to release information that they really didn't want to release. And Danielle Sutton works at PayPal and is working really hard to close the racial and gender pay gaps in tech, which is no small feat. It's really hard. So I want to start by talking about transparency, which is this buzzword we hear a lot. But people think it's like this key to closing the pay gap. And Natasha, you've pushed, like I said, these big companies, and I'll just name more, like Amazon and Google, to be more transparent. And you specifically have pushed them to tell us what their pay gaps are. Why is that the figure that you're pushing for?
Well, there's a couple of things here. It's why it's the figure and why transparency is so important. When we look at structural inequality at companies, and what we know, and what we've been talking about all morning, is the fact that there's so little diversity in the upper ranks and executive management teams on the board. And that structural inequality can be addressed through, there's many reasons that it's there, but the pay gap is one of them. And so if we can close the pay gap, step one, make sure women are being paid fairly for the work that they're doing today. Step two, close the more structural pay gap, the fact that they're not in those positions. And it's not just women. It's we need to be looking at racial and ethnic diversity as well, which we've pushed for and gotten a lot of companies to disclose. So we really do view it as one of the structural barriers. If you can remove it, we can help move more women into positions of leadership. And then the reason for transparency is simple accountability. And from the investor perspective, we look at accountability in terms of the data that we're getting from companies. And if we don't have the data, then we can't compare companies on an apples-to-apples basis. And what the real source of the problem, I think, is that we've had this compensation conversation locked up in a black box for decades. And there's a reason for that, because where there is money, there is power. And all of these conversations are about power and shifting the power balance. And so if you can shine light on it, sunlight is the best disinfectant. We can really expose what the issue is, and we can fix it.
So have you been successful in getting the apples-to-apples comparison? Because I know a lot of these companies don't want to tell you, they won't tell you their pay gaps exactly, right? They'll just give you a number that claims they pay women and men the same.
Well, I hope that those claims are true. Otherwise, I think they'll probably have to answer to the SEC or their investors. But what we've been able to get companies to do thus far is give us an equal pay for equal work number. And we were talking about this morning as well, why that's important. It's not the only thing that's important, because again, there's these structural gaps, the fact that men are holding those high-paying positions and making more money, and that also needs to be addressed. So, the numbers that we've gotten, I mean, when we started actually with eBay They didn't want to look at this. They came out and their board opposed our shareholder proposal. It went to a vote the first year. It only got an 8% vote. But the next year, when we started to get companies to move on this issue and disclose voluntarily, Intel and Apple, et cetera, and by the time eBay went to a vote that spring, I think we'd gotten 7 tech companies to disclose their pay gaps. And we got a 51% vote at eBay's annual meeting. But that said, there's a time gap between when we started engaging and when it was public knowledge that we were engaging and when they actually revealed those numbers. We saw that, so there's time for improvements to be made. We saw the same thing with the big banks. We started out in Silicon Valley, which is such a male-dominated field. And then we moved to Wall Street, another kind of boys club. And the first year that we went to 6 Wall Street banks, they said, no, we don't think it's going to look good. We're more conservative on the East Coast than we are on the West Coast. To which I said, are you too conservative to pay women fairly? And they simply didn't, put their numbers out. Now, fast forward to the beginning of this year, we were pressing them. We're saying, okay, you're going to have to put out your numbers in the UK, which are median gaps. It's going to show these structural deficiencies. You at least need to be doing an equal pay for equal work analysis and putting out those numbers. And, they had time to work on, do some internal work, make adjustments. So on Martin Luther King Jr. Day this year, Citibank was the first bank to move. They gave raises to women and minorities at the firm on that day, and they revealed, their gap. Now, the next step is addressing the structural issues.
I want to point out that I think we have another Bloomberg chart, but finance is a particularly bad industry. I think somewhere, not here, but it's like they pay women something like 67 cents on the dollar. That's compared to the 80 cents on the dollar figure. So Danielle, we've been talking about 2 different things. There's equal pay for equal work, and then there's representation at a company, which is really what contributes a lot to this pay gap. And I know PayPal has been working a lot on this VP level and above roles.
We've actually worked across the board at all levels, and we will be announcing our diversity data, which includes pay parity analysis for the 3rd year in a row this year, in the fall of 2018, and I'm really happy with the progress that we've made. It's been almost 3 years since the separation from eBay, and that's when the journey started for us to establish a new company with our new set of values, of which inclusion is one. And we spent a lot of time looking at our numbers. We do it pretty regularly. We've actually retained external support and industry leaders who help us develop the appropriate regression models so that we can make sure when we perform our analysis, it's covering the broadest subset of populations, the biggest sample sizes, looking at detail down to the most statistically significant relevant position possible, so that when we do run our analysis and we understand where we might have gaps, we reserve money so that we can close that gaps in order to achieve our pay parity. So it is really important, and we're really excited. We intend to maintain 100% pay parity for global women, as well as U.S. ethnicity as well.
What about that representation piece? Like, what are some of the challenges in getting that? Because I know your company's just a little under half, and I think it's more skewed male at the top. So,
well, we're 43% women, which is good. However, when you start to sort of narrow the funnel and look at certain job families and functions, there are areas where we're not as strong as we'd like to be. So, for example, in technology, we're like 22% women. But we spend a lot of time looking at our data and segmenting populations so that we're very targeted and focused. We obviously would like to improve, and we're just putting programs and initiatives in place in order to be able to do that more holistically.
So, Anil, you have a different version of transparency at your company. Unlike these companies that are releasing just figures, you're moving towards what we call radical transparency, where people share their salaries in their companies. Why is that the version of transparency you think might help close this pay gap?
There's a lot of sort of motivations behind it, and one of the things to sort of call out, we're a small company, and we've been around for 18 years, but we're not, working from scale. But at the same time, there have been some companies that have gotten attention with saying we're completely transparent about salary, but they do that from the beginning. And so to retrofit and go back and say we're going to move towards salary transparency, even though we had 17 years operating as a company without it, I think has been one of the big challenges. And the motivation for us, there's a couple sort of simple things. One, we're a small technology company. We compete for talent with Facebook, with Google, from those companies. People tend to choose us. And part of that reason why, they can be excited about whatever the products and the culture and these things. But one of the things is this guessing game. So that's one level. I think the second part is trust within a spreadsheet showing the ranges for every role of the company and the criteria by which you get there. All of a sudden, you can trust it. And we found it really helped within the team, people having a high level of trust with each other. So this year on Equal Pay Day, to have men on the team say and what we did is we give salary ranges, so we're sort of not getting down to the dollar for each person, just so there's a level of comfort with it.
Not yet.
Not yet. But this is what was interesting is men on our team, and some of the most tenured senior men on the team, electively saying women at the company or anybody of any gender, if you want to know what my salary is, reach out to me, send me a message, we'll talk through it, and giving that, volunteering to do that. That's the path. To me, that indicates the culture is set up right to be able to get on the path towards addressing these inequities. And I think, when we introduced this stuff, we found we had disparities, we had flaws, we had people that we'd been on one end, it's oh, this guy's been here forever and just keeps getting promoted, and that's great, but he's way out of band, and that's something to reckon with. And the other end is we had, advanced women at the company, and they had gone up in title but not commensurate in salary. So it was a small gap, but it was something where we were able to address it. And then, for me personally, to look at, we talk a lot about representation and inclusion. Asian American men are wildly over-indexed in tech, and we sort of don't talk about it because I think a lot of the people talking about this stuff are not Asian American men, and so they're very uncomfortable to call us out on it. But I look at it as CEO of Microsoft, Google, Adobe, are all Indian American men, and have very, very little to say about Black and Latino inclusion. We talk about wage gap it's a monolith, and it so varies by race. And we're not solving for just white women. We want to obviously welcome white women, but that's one component of a much larger challenge. So being able to have visibility across all those vectors makes it something we can actually address.
Can I add to something that Neil said, because I think this is really important and something we're trying to apply a lot of focus to. We're trying to really educate and train our leaders to have these courageous conversations, because we're also, for the very first time, arming them with data that they've never had, which includes compensation data of their employees and ranges. But if they are sloppy and not effective in how they respond to questions, how they engage in conversations and communications with their employees around this topic, we can forget about it. So we put a lot of our focus on just trying to build up the capability of our leaders to not be afraid of engaging in this conversation, but lean into it with data and facts.
Well, and the defensiveness. I mean, let's be real. That's the thing that trips these things up.
Absolutely.
Is
Their answer is, oh no, there's no problem, and they started to give a number. And but we actually had an open letter to Eric Schmidt saying, well, how can we trust this number when you're just constantly trying to band-aid this issue? And this year we had what seemed a very promising engagement with them. But when they came to us, we said, this is what we need. And then they came to us with the numbers, and they were covering 89% of their employees. And we're like, OK, well, who aren't you covering? It's one thing if oh, we're not doing this country yet, but we will next year. OK. But no, they were cutting the top off of the analysis and not including VPs and above. And we're like, what? Because it wasn't statistically significant. I said, OK, do a statistical analysis here, and then why don't you just average it over here? Because if there is less than 30 people, then we can, do some quick math.
But what they show is the transparency is coming, right? You can say you're not going to do it, but if your company's of size, you look at Tracy Chow and the movement she led, across, tech companies, but it'll happen in every industry. Them putting together a spreadsheet and putting their numbers out there, that's coming. So you can deny it, you can try to hold it off, but employees have the ability to do this. If you can empower them and take advantage of it, there's a huge opportunity.
Yeah, that's right.
If you're hearing this and you're like, well, I want to get ahead of the trend, and be like a Neil's company or even what PayPal and some of the banks and tech companies have done, what is the number one challenge that you wish you had known before going into the transparency conversation with your company beforehand that people could learn from?
It takes self-reflection. If it doesn't hurt, you're not doing the work.
Do you guys agree with that?
I completely agree. I think two things. Number one, when you arm leaders and employees with data, it needs to be accompanied by training and education so that they know how to interpret the results. I think the reason why we have been so just tirelessly focused on this, if you think about PayPal and our company, we are a company built of acquisitions. And every time you sort of acquire another company, especially if it's a company of size, that has the tendency or could have the ability to shift your results once again. So being very proactive, even on the front end of an acquisition or a deal, to know kind of what the impact will be and how do you address that as they're coming along within your company, I think would be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we have to wrap up, but thank you so much to our panelists, and I hope you guys learned something. And